Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my wrap-up and ranking for the semifinals of the Booktube Prize. I had Group B in the nonfiction category. Two of the books in this category were books I had read in the semifinals. His name is George Floyd, One Man's Life in the Struggle for Racial Justice by Robert Samuels and Toulouse Olorunipa. This is a one-part biography, or really one-third biography and two-thirds social history of the United States, and Ed Yong's An Immense World, How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Among Us. Not among us, around us. I say that every time. This is a popular science book, and is fantastic. Also, I believe when I talked about this last time, I had only read a digital copy. I have since gotten the hard copy out of the library, and I'm going to say, which only improves the experience because all of the color photo pages are a fantastic addition to that. Unfortunately, I have to say the reverse on His Name is George Floyd, which I discovered only after I posted my video for the quarterfinals. I had someone make a comment responding to someone else's comment, and they kind of called into question something that's in this book, and I went to find where it was written and flipped to what I expected to be the index. There is no index in this book. And for something that is, as I said, in large part a social history, that is a major flaw. So that is something that has docked points for that book for me, and had to, because I don't know how you can have a work of nonfiction, especially one that has a lot of research into it and that is trying to contradict a lot of misinformation that's been in the media, as well as telling all of this history. How you can not have an index in that is very strange to me and is a major flaw. And I kind of can't believe that I didn't notice that that was there before, because that is, that's quite unfortunate. A book like that needs an index so you can refer back to it, as I did the day I posted that video, and was disappointed to figure out that that wasn't there. Alright, so I'm going to discuss this in reverse ranking order, starting with the book that I put in last place. And unfortunately, the book that I ended up putting in last place was Elizabeth Williamson's Sandy Hook, An American Tragedy in the Battle for Truth. This is an interesting one because the cover design is very similar to the cover design that was on Dave Cullen's Columbine book, but this is a very different book because, again, this is about a mass shooting in the United States, but it is much less focused on the shooting itself and more focused on the misinformation and the propaganda kind of stuff and just the lies and conspiracy theories that sprung up afterwards. So the cover design being so similar visually, I think, is a little misleading for potential audiences. I'm not docking points from the book for that. That just was something that I thought as I was picking it up. So in this book, in the early chapters, Williamson does talk about the shooting itself, and this is, if you don't remember it, this is one in which all kinds of very young kindergarten children were killed. And just a hideous, just a horrible crime to think about. And then once we get past the first few chapters, she gets into the conspiracy theory stuff, which ends up with all these, which results in people harassing these poor parents who had lost children, telling them that they were actors and none of it had happened. It's just, it's horrific stuff. But I really didn't like the way this was told. For one thing, the style that she writes almost everything in is very over the top and kind of melodramatic, and it's such a heartbreaking topic that it doesn't need that. You could tell this story in a very straightforward way, and it wouldn't need to be, here we are traveling like geese in a V formation, or there's one point where she's talking about one of the fathers of one of the murdered children, and she's describing his grief as being like a metal bucket of water that he's carrying around. And I thought, no, his grief isn't a metal bucket. His grief is his child is dead. Like, why are you, the metaphors are terrible. I just couldn't imagine that how the author would think that people need that a reader couldn't empathize with these parents without these really heavy-handed metaphors, and I thought that was really frustrating early on. As we get into the later bits, the misinformation and how all of this stuff could stay on social media forever, this is kind of similar, those parts are kind of similar to a book that I talked about in the last round, Maria Reese's How to Stand Up to a Dictator. And similarly to that, I think when these books were being written only a couple of years ago, some of that was maybe less kind of ever present in the media and on social media, but I feel like this is a topic that has been reported on and that you see so often that a lot of it feels unnecessary, that there's so much focus. And that was the similar issue that I had with the other book. It becomes really boring because they are explaining something that is very present in the media culture these days. And I realize that this is something that's changed even 1 year, even within 6 months or a year. And so it is not necessarily a flaw in the writing of the book, because maybe and she was writing this for a number of years and researching it for a number of years. So obviously at the point she started it, it maybe wasn't so ever present in the media, but the reality is it is now, and it's just not that interesting to have to get long explanations how social media allows misinformation to spread. It's just, we've heard it. So some of that is just sort of an unfortunate side effect of the passage of time between when the author started working on this and when it was published, but it is just part of the reality that when you pick up this book, you are going to read huge sections of it and think, well, yes, we all know this kind of thing. Still, I think there's a lot of valuable information about this. I hadn't really realized how many conspiracy theories had popped up around this shooting, and that was horrific to read about, and it is gutting. And it's almost tempting to give this more points just because of the subject matter, but really I just didn't think it was as well done as it could have been. Now, I mean, with the complaining about the metaphors thing, I know there will be some people who will enjoy that and will think she's making interesting stylistic choices in a work of journalism, and you don't necessarily need to make that. But, you know, I really disliked the metaphors. It felt incredibly heavy-handed to me. So in 5th place, I had to put His Name is George Floyd, because as I said, I think the lack of an index in this is really, really unfortunate and is a flaw. If I want to give someone a social history, and again, I said this in the last video, it is hard to judge another social history when there have been good ones that won the Booktube Prize the last 2 years. So if I'm going to recommend someone a social history, it's just not going to be this book. And that's too bad, because it's certainly not a bad book, but the lack of an index is a problem for the kind of book that it's trying to be. So I think this is compelling, and I think it's absolutely worth reading, but the lack of an index baffles me. I don't understand why there's no index in this book. It's such a baffling omission. It makes no sense to me. And I mean, this is one of these things, like, if somebody's listening to the audiobook, they're not going to get the reference section. And also the references aren't numbered, which I think, again, if I want to find out where did that information come from, I have to make guesses based on quotes in the back. And again, I think if this were a strict biography, that would be okay. I would still rather have an index and have endnotes, proper endnotes, but you know, you could shrug that off because it's just a biography, but it's a social history. It needs better tabs to the references. I don't know. That is one, as I said, it was in number 2 in the quarterfinals for me, but the more I looked at the notes in the reference section, the more disappointed I became in it. In number 4, I put Rachel Aviv's Strangers to Ourselves, Unsettled Minds and the Stories That Make Us. This is a really entertaining, or engaging anyway, book to read. Entertaining is maybe the wrong word for some of the stories in this. In this book, the author follows a number of people. The first one is actually herself. She was diagnosed with anorexia at 6. And probably didn't actually have anorexia at that point, but was sent to an inpatient treatment center where she met teenagers who actually had anorexia and kind of guided her through actually developing it. And what the rest of the stories in this book do are tell similar stories in which the mental health care systems or theories fail people, basically, and fail people in a variety of ways. So there is one story about a man who was quite well off, and he paid to spend a year in inpatient therapy, having talk therapy for depression, and he sued at the end because his feeling was they could have given him drugs and he would have been fine in 2 months, so this was a waste of his time. And that was at a point when the shift from talk therapy to medication had just been taking over, so that's sort of an interesting turning point in terms of both liability and how much people in the US like to sue and just the different elements like that. Then in the next one we meet a woman in South India, and she is bonding with the gods, and she wants to move to an ashram and dedicate herself to writing devotional poetry. And her husband decides that she's mentally ill, and she ends up diagnosed with schizophrenia and being institutionalized. And then later on, her children kind of free her, and she's able to write more religious poetry. And it's a dilemma of, in a different context, she would just be, you know, a religious figure. She'd be a saint. She'd be some kind of religious teacher. But instead, for this middle portion of her life, she was treated incredibly poorly and subjected to a lot of experimental psychiatric treatment that was terrible. So again, an interesting story. And then there's a pairing of stories about two younger American women. One is a black woman living in poverty who ends up under-medicated and in prison. One is a white, rich American woman who ends up over-medicated, and how attitudes towards mental illness have impacted their lives in ways that are really interesting contrast, having these two sections together. And then finally, the author focuses on one of the girls who had been in this inpatient treatment with her when she was a child, and this person has recently died, and goes through this woman's diaries and looks at what her life was like. And all of these stories are fascinating, but the book itself has no central linking. And readers will obviously make the connection that this is about flaws or gaps in mental health care in the United States and in India, but there's never any kind of central line that the author is putting through. Now, she's somebody who writes for the New Yorker. Each of these profiles could be an article in the New Yorker, and it would be a perfectly fine article, right? And I think if this were presented as a collection of unrelated articles that happen to be on a similar theme, I think that would be better than having this presented as a single work, because it just doesn't feel like a single work. It was engaging, I was interested in it, the stories are fascinating, but there's nothing linking them together. So for a book, and judging the book, as a whole, and not just as the individual pieces, I think that's a real flaw. It's kind of similar to the issue with His Name is George Floyd. I think both of these books are very good and very compelling, but if I am ranking them compared to books that work better for a single work of nonfiction, they just can't be, they just don't really succeed at the same level. So, yeah, it was very interesting, but each of the individual stories were interesting, but there was just nothing linking them together aside from some vague, this is kind of related to mental health, and that's it. Now, I think that's kind of interesting reading and watching people's reviews of the book, because I think everybody brings their own baggage in and makes their own linkages. And that's fascinating and kind of fun to watch itself, but the author isn't creating that. The content is creating that itself. So if they had been just articles that you collected and pasted together, that wouldn't be any different than having them collected in the book. There's nothing, yeah, it's just not linked by the author herself, which I think is a real weakness. At number 3, I put Under the Skin by Linda Villarosa, The Hidden Toll of Racism on American Lives and the Health of Our Nation. This book, most of this book is about racial inequality in healthcare and the disproportionately high maternal and infant death rate among black women in the United States. Just horrific, horrific stuff that has been brushed off for a long time as being a side effect of lifestyle choices and maybe of poverty, but which additional studies over the years have shown has something to do with that, but also something to do with the general stress of facing racism within the U.S. context. And there's some fascinating bits about West African and Jamaican immigrant women who, if they have their children in the early years when they've moved to the United States, don't have the higher risks that are associated with other black women in the United States, but then their children do, even if they've gone up class-wise and income-wise, and that's all really fascinating. There are a number of pieces where the author does basically a case study, and then, or not necessarily a case study, but just a single person's experience and then the statistics under that, which is just fantastic. I mean, it's really horrific, but also fascinating, and again, it's the kind of thing that is easy to recommend to people and say, hey, do you want to know about this topic, or you should know about this topic for people who work in healthcare? And this is just a fantastic book to pass along in those cases. The reason this is only in third is that there are a couple of pieces in the book where she is going off onto slightly different topics. with a few of them, it's things that aren't about the increased risks up to maternal and infant health. And those just don't feel as connected to the rest of the book and aren't necessarily as strong. For example, there are bits where she's talking about high blood pressure, and it just feels less connected, even though I think a lot of the innate connections are still there, but it doesn't flow with the maternal and infant health bits as well. There is another section where she is talking about poverty among poor white Americans in the Rust Belt. And again, that feels really disconnected from everything else, even though she's trying to bring together a point about the impact of stress on health. So I think this would have been just an absolute five out of 5 stars if it had exclusively been about the maternal and infant health issues. As it is, I think this is very good and well worth recommending, but in terms of I'm ranking it for this for the Booktube Prize, so it has to go a little bit. So it just didn't quite make it into number 2 for me, but still interesting. But, you know, still definitely worth reading. In number 2, I put The Escape Artist by Jonathan Friedland. The subheading on this one is The Men Who Broke Out of Auschwitz to Warn the World. This is a really compellingly told story, which surprised me because I think you look at Second World War stories and you look at Holocaust stories and you think, can there be anything new that you can tell me? And this felt like something both new and compelling, where even though we know that this man survived, the author still manages to build suspense as he's talking about the various times he tried to escape from, not just from Auschwitz, but originally to try to not be deported from Slovakia, and then from the transport trains and all of this. And it is surprising how well the suspense building is done, because I think that's incredibly difficult to do in something where we know what the ultimate outcome is. And I think the added fascinating bit is that I think in a piece of fiction, there are often stories like this where people are going to escape something, tell the media, and everything will work out. And the kind of really depressing part is that this guy did escape from Auschwitz and was trying to warn the Hungarian Jews who hadn't been deported to concentration camps yet, and to let them know, you're going to all be killed. And the interesting and the fascinating and depressing part is that people overwhelmingly didn't believe him. And not just in the sense that Western governments didn't believe him because they had anti-Semitic attitudes and said Jews always exaggerate, but literally the Hungarian Jewish community didn't believe him. While some people were able to avoid deportation, most of them did not. And so the end sections are about him grappling with that for the rest of his life. And I think one of the really fascinating bits is that there is one person who did believe it and escaped and is living it, and ultimately moved to Sweden, who later comments that basically no one over the age of 25 believed anything, but younger people could because they weren't set into their ideas of the world. And that's really fascinating because I think that's something people talk about with everything from horrors in a variety of countries to things like climate change to, you know, why is there a generational difference in attitudes? And this was very much about that. So yeah, it's an interesting story, and it's told really successfully in a way that I think is difficult to do when you have something that has a set outcome. And I'm going to say I liked this despite the fact that my impression of Jonathan Friedland, the author, going into this was quite negative. I've seen some of his political things. He's expressed some political views that I disagree with. And so I was very cautious going into this because I was thinking, you know, I'm going to be biased against this author. And that did not come into it at all. It helped that his subject had rather different political views. I don't know why I'm being vague. Jonathan Friedland has Zionist attitudes, and his subject matter was an anti-Zionist, not for being against settler colonialism, essentially, because he did end up in Canada, but, you know, mostly because people who didn't listen to him when he did this escape ended up in politics in Israel. But in any case, my negative thoughts towards things Jonathan Friedland has said towards, especially to some of the things he said about the Labour Party in the UK, didn't come into play. So I have to say this book was great because it got over my biases that I had towards the author. So yeah, I went in thinking I don't like this author, but I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was very successful. In every way that it should be, right? For the kind of story that it's trying to be and all of that. And at number 1, I put Immense World there again because my feelings on this have not changed from what I said in the quarterfinals. It is basically everything that you want a pop science book to be. Lots of facts, documented, solid reference section. It has full color photos on glossy paper in the middle. It's exactly what you want a pop science book to be. And I've seen some people who ranked this lower in the last rounds specifically because they don't like pop science, but I feel like even if you don't like it, you have to acknowledge that this is a good example of it. And I mean, if you don't, I'd love to hear what you think is wrong with this as a pop science book. Not you personally don't like pop science, because that's fair. But do you think there are other pop science books that are exploring a similar kind of topic in a better way? Because I don't know if anybody's had that complaint. As I said, all the ones that I saw were just people who don't like pop science, which is fair, but it's not really a critique of the book, because like, do you not want people to read about animals? I don't know. But anyway, yeah, I think that's fantastic. I mean, we like what we like, but information should be out there. Anyway, that's what I thought about the books in my group. If you were reading this group, I'd love to hear what you thought. If you had the other group, I'd love to hear how that went. And if you made a video that I haven't watched, let me know, because I really enjoy seeing what everybody thought. And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.